We are here at the Oregon Council for Social Studies conference at the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, speaking with Robert Miller, author of Native America, Discovered and Conquered, Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark, and Manifest Destiny. Mr. Miller, your book talks a lot about the doctrine of discovery. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
The doctrine of discovery is a legal principle that describes how Europeans came to this continent and claimed the lands from the native people. The doctrine was literally developed by the Church and Portugal and Spain in the late 1400s. And European countries used this legal principle to claim lands in Africa, Asia, and of course in the Americas. The classic painting or the classic example of explorers coming ashore and sticking their flag and their cross in the soil, usually the caption for that in various paintings is that they were thanking God for a safe voyage across the ocean. Well, that might be true, but Europeans were also engaged in a legal procedure when they were putting their flags and crosses in the soil. They literally were claiming the land for their own king and their own country.
And does the doctrine of discovery still impact any government decisions today?
Absolutely. The United States Supreme Court adopted this doctrine of discovery in an 1823 Supreme Court case called Johnson v. McIntosh. And the court decided to borrow this international law that the European countries had developed on how they would divide up and claim the world. And so as part of American law, we adopted that in this case, Johnson v. McIntosh, to decide what rights tribes held in their own lands. And even though that's an 1823 Supreme Court case, and even though the doctrine of discovery itself is 500 years old, that is still the law in America today for Indian tribes and for some Indian people. The lands that tribes own, for example, the United States is considered to be the legal owner of those lands, reservations, etc., and the tribe is called the beneficial owner. And so this doctrine of discovery still applies in Indian country today. And in fact, guess what Russia did on August the 2nd, 2007? It, of course, planted a flag 2 miles below the surface of the Arctic Ocean. Plainly, Russia is using this charade, if we want to call it that, as a claim for the resources that Russia claims is there, or that we all know is there, 10 billion tons of oil and gas.
In the foreword to your book, written by Elizabeth First, she writes that history is an elusive and misleading discipline, and it's practically impossible to find unbiased history and one that's not filtered through preconceived notions, and that's why this book is so important. How is your book different from other history books on this subject?
Well, I am a Native person. I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, and I teach Indian law and have for over 15 years. So I do look at historical events through a different eye, perhaps, than someone else. I am also a lawyer and a law professor, so I see events that happen in American history through their legal meaning. And so the doctrine of discovery is something that I'm very familiar with. And so when my tribe appointed me to be involved with the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, I immediately thought, well, I would write about the doctrine of discovery. What did Thomas Jefferson think about it? What did Lewis and Clark do that looked like the doctrine of discovery when they were out in the Oregon country, literally claiming the lands for the United States? So history then, it is important who writes history, because we wonder why minorities and females, for example, and of course Indian people, are left out of history. Well, that's because a whole lot of European males wrote the history books, and then of course here in America again. It depends on who writes the history as to what they might emphasize or what they think is most important. One reviewer of my book said that it was a revisionist history, but he said revisionism in the best way possible, because it gave a new slant on American history, on Thomas Jefferson's ideas about the Louisiana Purchase and about the Lewis and Clark expedition, and then about Manifest Destiny itself. So what I hope my book does is approaches history from a different slant and gives us another viewpoint, one that has been mostly ignored.
What do you think the U.S. government needs to do today to help right some of their earlier wrongs?
The doctrine of discovery has been American law for over 500 years. In the conclusion of my book, I really don't have some fabulous suggestion on what we can do about the doctrine of discovery today. But I do give a couple simple suggestions that maybe Congress could appoint a blue ribbon commission that tribes are involved in, or maybe some congressional committee could examine the remnants of the doctrine of discovery that are still part of American Indian law today. Why are we still using this Eurocentric, ethnocentric, religiously inspired law to limit the rights of Indian tribes and Indian people in their own properties today? So what we can do, it can't be something too radical, because we don't like to change property law too radically, and it has been the property law in the Western world for the past 500 or 600 years.
And you write in the end of your book that you're confident there's more evidence that the government uses doctrine of discovery, and since you finished writing, you've been able to find more evidence. So where do you go from here? Are you still conducting research on this?
Yes. In fact, I just signed a contract to write another book with an Australian Aborigine woman who's a professor in Sydney, a Maori woman who's a professor in New Zealand, and a First Nations woman who's a professor in Canada. And the four of us are going to write a book about how England used the doctrine of discovery in our four countries. What sort of prompted us to do this is that our four countries are the only four in the entire United Nations who voted against the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in September of 2007. We found it very unique that only 4 nations in the United Nations voted against the rights of Indigenous people. And so we talked about, what do those 4 nations have in common? Well, obviously, it's English colonization using these doctrine of discovery principles against the native people. And so that's my next project and the further research in the doctrine of discovery.
We've been speaking with Robert Miller, author of Native America, Discovered and Conquered, Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark, and Manifest Destiny. Thank you.
Did you know you can view Book TV programs online? Go to booktv.org. Type the name of the author, book, or subject into the search area in the upper left-hand corner of the page. Select the Watch link. Now you can view the entire program. You might also explore the Recently on Book TV box or the Featured Programs box to find and view recent and featured programs.